The wind bit through her coat like it had teeth. Mary Ellis pulled the collar tighter around her neck, though the fabric was threadbare and smelled faintly of mothballs and starch. Her gloved fingers, one missing its thumb, gripped the rusted handle of her wheeled laundry cart. The metal squeaked in protest with every uneven step across the cracked sidewalk of 77th Street. "Always winter and never Christmas," she murmured to herself, eyes half-lidded against the icy gusts sweeping through Southside Chicago. The cold had been unrelenting this January. Inside her little brick home, the heater had coughed its final breath 3 days ago. The city said they'd send someone. No one came. She made do with boiled water, extra blankets, and prayer. The world hadn't been kind to Mary, not since the day Clarence died. Cancer took him fast. 3 months from diagnosis to the funeral. His smile faded from her world like the sun vanishing behind clouds, permanently. And then came Lisa. Her only child. Sweet Lisa with her wide eyes and even wider dreams. Killed by a drunk driver just weeks before her college graduation. That phone call had hollowed Mary from the inside out. Since then the house had felt more like a shell than a home. Still she walked tall. Dignity was all she had left, and it was stitched into the seams of her very being. The laundromat was closing when she arrived. Mr. Guzman, the owner, gave her a half-smile from behind the glass. "You're lucky, Miss Ellis. 10 more minutes and I'd have locked up." "I appreciate you, Manuel," she replied, stepping inside, dragging her cart like a wounded soldier returning from war. "You're the last decent man in this city." He chuckled. "Don't say that too loud. My wife's in the back." Mary smiled but didn't laugh. Her hands moved with practiced grace, folding the worn clothes, each piece a memory of better days. A flannel shirt Clarence used to wear. Lisa's old hoodie. A towel with the church logo fading into nothing. Outside, dusk settled like ash. She knew she should hurry home before the streetlights flickered on. Southside after dark wasn't kind to old bones. On her way past the bakery's back alley, she heard the clang of a trash can lid. Then a shuffle. A whimper. At first she thought it might be a dog. Then she saw him. He couldn't have been older than 10. Skinny as a stick, his ribs visible beneath a tattered tank top that belonged in August, not January. He was knee-deep in a dumpster, trembling. "Boy," Mary called, voice stern but not unkind. He froze, eyes wide like a stray. In his hand, a crust of bread, half-molded. A large man burst out the back door of the bakery, apron-stained, wielding a broom like a sword. "Hey. I told you if I caught you again, I'd beat the hell outta. Don't you lay a hand on him." Mary barked, stepping between them. The man blinked, caught off guard. "Lady, this kid's been stealing for weeks." "He's starving." "Not stealing." The man huffed, adjusted his apron. "Ain't my job to feed every rat in this city." Mary's gaze sharpened. "Then thank God some of us still remember how to be human." She turned to the boy who stood frozen in fear, his lips cracked and bluish. "What's your name?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "Jacob." "You got somewhere to go, Jacob?" His silence was answer enough. "Come on," she said, holding out her hand. "You'll freeze to death out here." He didn't take her hand. But he followed. Inside Mary's home, the air was thick with cold and silence. She lit a few candles, their flames flickering against the stained wallpaper. In the kitchen, she opened a can of potatoes and dumped them into a pot with water, salt, and hope. She caught Jacob eyeing the bookshelf, particularly a picture frame with Lisa in her cap and gown. "My daughter," she said. "She pretty?" Jacob mumbled. "Smart too. Wanted to be a lawyer. Would have been if..." She stopped. Stirred the soup. Jacob sat at the table, his knees pulled to his chest under the coat she gave him. His eyes kept darting toward the door. Like he was still halfway gone. "I don't got nothing to give you that's worth anything," Mary said, placing the steaming bowl in front of him. "But what I got, I share." He devoured the soup like he hadn't eaten in days. Probably hadn't. Afterwards, she handed him a thin blanket, then walked into the back room. When she returned, she was holding a plain white envelope. Inside, $327. She placed it on the table. Jacob looked at it like it might explode. "That's yours?" "Was," she said. "For emergencies." His voice cracked. "Why were you giving it to me?" She sat down across from him, her back aching from the cold. Her eyes locked onto his. "Because somebody once helped me when they didn't have to. And I ain't got much time left. But if you remember anything about me, let it be this." She slid the envelope across the table. "Don't pay me back. Just become somebody who does the same for someone else." He stared at her. For a long time. Then, with trembling fingers, he took the envelope. That night, Jacob slept on her couch. Mary barely did. She listened to the wind scream outside, then to the soft breathing of the boy inside, and wondered what kind of world would throw children into the streets like trash. When the sun came up, the couch was empty. Jacob was gone. No note. No goodbye. Not even the blanket. Just the smell of soup and cold. 10 years passed like falling snow, soft, quiet, and unforgiving. Mary Ellis didn't talk much about the boy who had vanished. Sometimes, in the deep silence of her cold little home, she wondered if she had dreamed him up. A starving child with haunted eyes, a warm bowl of soup, an envelope with the last of her savings, it all sounded like something out of a sermon. Still, she never mentioned it to anyone at church. Not to Miss Claudette, who called every week just to make sure she was alive. Not to Pastor Harris, who offered rides and always looked disappointed when she declined. And certainly not to the social workers who came once a year, took notes, and vanished like phantoms. She didn't need their pity. Pity was cheap. What Mary needed, what she had always needed, was a job that didn't end at age 62, a furnace that worked, a husband who wasn't buried in Oakwood Cemetery, and a daughter who still smiled from the kitchen doorway asking, "You want coffee, Mama?" But the world didn't run on needs. It ran on electricity and bills and who you know, and Mary had never known the right people. Her days were quiet now. She woke at 6, boiled water for instant coffee, read her Bible by the window even when her fingers shook from the cold. On good days, she shuffled to the community center for groceries. On bad days, she stayed in bed and listened to the pipes groan through the walls. But she was proud. That never left her. When the young volunteers offered to repaint her front steps, she thanked them, then spent the night scrubbing the porch so they wouldn't see the mildew. When the neighbors' kids shoveled her walkway after a blizzard, she baked them cornbread she couldn't afford to make. She always said, "You don't need much to be good. Just enough to share." Still, winters got longer. Her breath got shorter. And the house was dying. The roof leaked during spring rains. One of the kitchen tiles collapsed and she covered it with an old welcome mat. The bathtub drain backed up for 2 years until she learned to wash in a basin. Once she found a dead mouse in her cereal box. She didn't scream. Just threw the box away and laughed, an ugly rusted laugh. "Guess you needed it more than I did," she told the empty kitchen. In New York City, Dr. Jacob Turner sat in his glass-walled office, staring at the snowfall through the window. Below him, the city moved in its usual rhythm, rushed, loud, indifferent. His nonprofit, Horizon Health, had just passed a milestone, over 200,000 patients treated across 4 states. He'd given interviews to Time, The Atlantic, and NPR. There were murmurs about a MacArthur Genius Grant. His name was being floated for something called a living legacy. None of it felt real. Not compared to that night in Chicago. Not compared to her. He remembered every detail. Her eyes. Her voice. Her hands rough with years of work but warm. That old quilt she wrapped around him. The clink of the spoon against the bowl. The envelope. And most of all, her words. "Don't pay me back. Just become somebody who does the same for someone else." He had. But it never felt like enough. She had changed the entire trajectory of his life in one act of radical kindness. And he had never even said thank you. She deserved to know what she'd done. Who he'd become. That her sacrifice hadn't disappeared into the cold. But he never found her again. He had tried. For years he searched, shelters, churches, even police records. But all he had was a name, Mary L. Ellis, and a fading memory of her street. He once drove through that old neighborhood, heart pounding, looking for a familiar window, a crack in the brick, a front step with rusted iron railings. He didn't find her. Chicago was full of Marys. And most of them were buried under a system too broken to keep track of the living, much less the forgotten. Back in South Side, another winter pressed down like a weight. Mary was 78 now. The little pains had become big ones. Her knees howled when she stood. Her lungs burned when she climbed the porch steps. But she didn't complain. Then one morning she didn't get out of bed. It wasn't that she couldn't. It was that her body had quietly decided it was time to stop pretending. She tried to sit up, but her vision tilted sideways. The cold in the room seemed to fill her chest like smoke. She passed out sometime between dawn and mid-morning. A neighbor's daughter found her 3 hours later, when she came to drop off a casserole. The girl screamed. An ambulance came. The year was packed. Flu season. Understaffed. Overcrowded. Mary was just another elderly patient on a gurney in a hallway. Her temperature was dangerously low. Blood pressure barely readable. Her ID was expired. No insurance on file. No next of kin. A social worker wrote, unresponsive elderly female, unknown history, possible exposure-related hypothermia. No Medicaid registration found. Needs transfer to long-term care pending evaluation. That's how her name ended up in a system that eventually filtered through Horizon Health's new outreach database for critical high-risk elder patients. Jacob's team forwarded the report to his inbox with the subject line, potential candidate for Chicago pilot program, urgent review requested. He almost deleted it. Then he saw the name. Mary L. Ellis. The coffee cup in his hand dropped and shattered. Jacob arrived at Chicago's Cook County Hospital 12 hours later. When he walked into the room, he barely recognized her. The woman in the hospital bed was frail, smaller, paler, her face sunken, hair gray and thin, lips cracked, arms bruised from failed 4 attempts. But her hands, he would never forget those hands. He approached slowly, his throat tight, tears rising before he could stop them. "Miss Mary?" he whispered as if afraid the sound might break her. She didn't stir. He sat by the bed, reached for her hand and held it tight. "You saved me," he said, voice trembling. "You saved me and I never got to tell you." He looked at the machines. The cold, blinking monitors. The 4 dripping antibiotics. The nurse's notes in the chart, no known family, low response, observed for 48 hours. Jacob shook his head. No, not like this. He made the calls. He signed the forms. He moved heaven and earth. Within 36 hours, Mary was transferred to a private long-term care facility with round-the-clock nursing, climate control, and an actual fireplace in the lounge. Jacob visited her every single day. And every day he sat by her bedside and told her stories. About his work. About the clinic. About the people he had helped. He told her she was the reason he became a doctor. He told her she was the reason hundreds of children were alive today. And then one day as snow fell again outside the window, her hand twitched in his. She opened her eyes. The first thing Mary saw when she opened her eyes was a ceiling too white to be her own. The second was a young man asleep in a chair by her bedside, his body slumped forward, one hand still holding hers. She stared at him for a long while, blinking slowly, unsure of where she was, or why her chest ached when she breathed. The room smelled of antiseptic and old flowers. Her lips were cracked, her skin dry as parchment. There was a silence inside her that felt too vast to be normal, and yet somehow peaceful. She moved her hand slightly. The young man stirred. "Mary," he said instantly, straightening, eyes wide with hope and something deeper, something like love. She frowned, her voice rasping like gravel. You know me?" He smiled through tears. "Yes," he said softly. "And you knew me. Once." She studied him, her vision blurry. "You're not Clarence," she murmured. "No," he chuckled, then wiped his eyes quickly. "But I've been hoping you'd wake up for weeks now." His face was familiar in a strange way. Not like a friend you'd forgotten. More like a song you used to love and hadn't heard in decades. "You hungry?" he asked. "I brought your favorite. Apple juice. And some cornbread from Miss Claudette's church kitchen. Still warm." Mary blinked again. "How do you know what I like?" There was a long pause. He sat beside her again and looked into her tired eyes. "I was 10 years old," he began. "It was winter. I was digging through the trash behind a bakery in Southside. You stopped a man from beating me. You brought me into your home. Fed me soup. Gave me your blanket. And you gave me your last money." Mary's hand slowly rose to her chest. Her eyes began to shine. "I remember a boy," she whispered. "Jacob." He nodded. "I thought you were dead." "I almost was," he said, voice tight. "Until you gave me a reason not to be." She turned her face slightly, tears sliding into her hair. "I waited for you," she whispered. "Every day for a week. Then every week for a month. Then I told myself I'd imagined it all. I never forgot you," he said. "I searched for you. For years." A long silence settled between them, thick with history, absence, and time. And then he said the words he'd rehearsed 100 times. "I became a doctor, Mary. A real one. I help people who don't have anyone else. Like I didn't. Like you did." She gave a weak laugh. "Well, I'll be damned." Over the next few days, Mary regained strength. Her voice returned. Her memory sharpened. Jacob stayed by her side, refusing to leave the city until he knew she was safe. He brought her flowers, clean socks, lotion for her dry hands. He read to her from Psalms, and sometimes when the nurses weren't around, he wheeled her out into the sunroom just to sit and watch the snow fall. But something tugged at Jacob. A feeling. A pattern in her voice, in the way she talked about her daughter Lisa. About her past. He asked about Lisa, often wanting to know more. Lisa was light, Mary would say. Born too soon. Grew up too fast. She always wanted to escape, but she never ran. Not really. She went to college? Mary nodded slowly. City college. Wanted to study law. Said she was going to change things. Jacob hesitated. Did she have a boyfriend? Mary stiffened slightly. Lisa was private. After Clarence died, she kept things to herself. But there were signs. I think something happened in her last year of high school. Something she never told me. Jacob's pulse quickened. What kind of signs? She withdrew. Wouldn't eat much. Didn't smile as much. Then one day she was gone for 3 days. Said she was at a friend's. But she came back, different. Jacob leaned forward, heart pounding. Do you think she could have had a baby? And given it up? Mary's face froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He didn't need confirmation. He saw it in her eyes. Jacob left the facility that night with a spinning head and a wild heart. He didn't sleep. Instead, he called an old contact from his days working with family medical research and requested a quiet DNA test, just to settle the thought that had begun to burn in his chest like a fire. He sent in samples, his and Mary's. No name. Just initials. Just signs. Then he waited. Mary noticed the change in him over the next few days. He was quieter, distracted. Kind still, but somewhere else behind the eyes. And on the 5th morning, when he walked into her room holding a sealed envelope, her hands trembled before he even spoke. "What is that?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "I think you already know." He placed it in her lap. Her fingers, frail but determined, opened the seal. Inside, a single sheet of paper. She scanned it slowly. Then again. Her eyes filled with tears. She looked up at him. "Lisa?" He nodded. Your grandson." She covered her mouth, shaking. "Oh, Lord Jesus." Tears slid freely down her cheeks, silent and unbroken. You were mine," she whispered. "All this time, you were mine." He dropped to his knees by her bed, resting his head on her stomach like a child. "I never had a mother," he said. "But maybe I've always had a grandmother." She held his face in her hands, wrinkled fingers brushing tears away. "You were never lost," she whispered. "God just needed time to bring you home." They stayed like that for a long time. The nurses stood quietly outside the door. No one dared interrupt. Later that week, Jacob held a press conference in Bronzeville. In front of a crowd of reporters, donors, and neighbors, he unveiled the sign for his new project. The Ellis House. A shelter for homeless elders, abandoned children, and single mothers. "People talk a lot about miracles," he told the cameras. "But the only miracle I know is that a woman who had every reason to turn away, didn't. She didn't just feed me. She gave me a future. A name. A path. She didn't know I was her blood. She did it because it was right. That's what dignity is. That's what love looks like." Inside the crowd, Mary sat in a wheelchair, wrapped in a new coat, tears in her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her story had already been told. Not through words, but through a life saved and a legacy begun. Mary Ellis had never liked attention. She preferred the back row at church, the quiet lane at the grocery store, the last pew during funerals. But now, somehow, she was on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The grandmother who raised a nation's doctor. That's what they called her. A photo of her in the wheelchair at the Ellis House ribbon cutting filled the center spread. She hated the picture. Her eyes looked tired, but her hands were clasped tightly in Jacob's. "I didn't raise him," she said, waving the paper at the nurse. "I fed him one meal and gave him a blanket." The nurse smiled gently. "Well, seems that was enough." The Ellis House opened 2 weeks later. The building was nothing fancy, just an old church converted into something warmer, with freshly painted rooms, working heat, a kitchen that never closed, and donated beds. But inside it felt holy. On the first night, 6 teenage boys arrived from a shelter downtown. 2 of them didn't talk. One had a black eye. Mary sat in the corner of the room and just nodded at them. Didn't push. Didn't ask questions. They stared at her like she was part ghost, part saint. That night, she made a pot of soup and watched them eat in silence. "I've made this before," she whispered, half to herself. Jacob stood beside her, arms crossed. "You made it for me." She looked up at him. "Did I?" He nodded. "It was the first time anyone fed me without expecting something in return." She smiled. Well, don't get used to it. Next time I'm charging rent. He laughed and she chuckled too. It felt strange laughing again. Like learning to walk after a long time in bed. Jacob stayed in Chicago longer than he'd planned. He set up a new wing at Horizon Health in the South Side, partnering with local clinics. He split his time between New York and Illinois, but his visits with Mary were daily. Routine. Sacred. Sometimes they sat on the porch of her old home, now newly restored by volunteers and donations. The front steps were painted blue. The roof no longer leaked. And inside, a furnace hummed like a prayer answered. "You fixed everything," she said one afternoon. He shook his head. "Just the house." "No," she said softly. "You fixed the part of me I thought was gone forever." As spring bloomed across the city, Mary began walking short distances again. Her strength returned in slow, stubborn bursts. The local news came by for an interview. She wore a new coat Jacob had given her, dark green with brass buttons, and a hat too large for her head. The young reporter, all polished teeth and wide eyes, asked, "What would you say to other people who feel forgotten?" Mary leaned forward slightly, eyes clear, voice strong. "We ain't forgotten. We're just quiet. And quiet people don't make headlines, but sometimes they make history." But the truth is, it wasn't all easy. Mary and Jacob were family, yes, but not the kind of family that had birthday albums or stories passed down. There were gaps. Moments of awkwardness. Sometimes they didn't know what to say. At times, Mary would look at him and think, "Where were you all these years?" And Jacob would sit across from her and wonder, what would she have said if I'd known sooner? One afternoon in the garden behind Ella's house, Mary finally asked it. "If you'd known I was your grandmother back then, would you have stayed?" Jacob took a long time to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "I was scared. Angry. I didn't trust anyone. I think I had to grow into the kind of man who could come back." She nodded slowly. "You did come back. That's what matters." He looked at her, eyes clouded. "I just wish Lisa had told you." Mary's jaw tightened. "I used to wonder about that," she said. "But maybe she was scared too. She was young. And proud like me. Maybe she didn't want me to see her ashamed." "You never would have judged her." "No. But she might have judged herself." She leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, breathing in the scent of lilacs and earth. "She left me twice," Mary whispered. "Once in a car and once with a secret. But she gave me you. And maybe that's her way of coming home." In June, Ella's house held its first community dinner. Mary insisted on cooking. She made her famous sweet potato casserole, 3 trays of cornbread, and enough baked chicken to feed a football team. She wore a white apron with Ella's house, founded in love, embroidered across the chest. Dozens came, neighbors, elders, kids, single moms, folks fresh out of rehab, and some still fighting the streets. Mary stood at the front of the room, spoon in hand, and banged the pot gently like a church bell. "Listen here," she said. "Some of y'all feel like you got no people. Well, you got 'em now. Right here. This is family." The room erupted in applause. Jacob stood in the back, arms crossed, watching her like a man who'd found the last missing piece of a puzzle he didn't know he'd been building. She caught his eye and winked. Later that night, as they sat alone in the quiet dining hall, Mary turned to him. "You know, I still don't believe in coincidence," she said. Jacob smiled. "Neither do I. You think Lisa sees us?" He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I think she's been watching this whole time. Just waiting for us to find each other." Mary nodded. "I hope she's proud." "She would be," Jacob said. "Of both of us." Mary looked down at her hands, worn, veined, strong. "Then I guess we did okay." The second winter after Ella's house opened was gentler than the one Jacob remembered. Maybe it was the new insulation. Or maybe it was the warmth coming from the inside now. Dozens of people living, healing, laughing under the same roof. Either way, the cold didn't feel so cruel. Mary still rose early, just before sunrise, and sat in the sunroom with a cup of decaf and a wool shawl over her shoulders. She watched the light slide across the frozen sidewalks, listened to the hum of the heater, and sometimes whispered scripture under her breath. She looked older now, more delicate, like everything in her had finally begun to settle. But her eyes remained sharp, alive. Every Thursday morning she taught a group of teen girls how to sew and budget their money. "You don't need much to be good," she'd say. "Just enough to share." The phrase had become something of a motto at Ella's house, printed on t-shirts, posters, even the new welcome mat. Jacob had it stitched into the sleeve of his coat. By spring, Ella's house was full. 12 elderly residents, 9 teens, 4 single mothers with their children. There were waiting lists now, people from other boroughs calling daily, asking if there was room. "We need another building," Jacob told Mary one night, pacing in her room. Mary chuckled from her chair. "You're starting to sound like a politician." He laughed. "Don't curse me like that." She gave him a look. "Just don't forget what this place is. Not a program. Not a charity. A home." "I won't," he said seriously. "I know," she smiled. "You're mine." Jacob eventually moved full-time to Chicago. He bought a house 2 blocks from Ellis' house. Nothing fancy. A small garden. A porch with a swing. Enough for visits. Enough for peace. He split his time between patient care and community work. His name kept showing up in articles and public health journals. People called him visionary, radical, even saint. He hated that word, because the real saint was sitting in a rocking chair a few blocks away, humming old hymns while mending clothes. She never asked for recognition. She just wanted people to be warm. In late summer, Mary caught a cold that turned into something worse. Pneumonia, they said. She spent 4 days in the hospital and then she asked to go home. Not her old house, Ellis' house. "This is where I belong," she told the nurses. She didn't want machines or tubes. Just warm tea, soft blankets, and Jacob reading scripture by her bed. One night, as he closed the book and kissed her forehead, she looked up at him. "Do you ever wonder why it had to happen like this?" "All the time," he said. She smiled. "Me too. But maybe, this is how redemption works." She took his hand. "Promise me something. Anything. Don't stop. Even when I'm gone." His throat closed, but he nodded. "You won't be gone," he said quietly. "You'll be everywhere." Mary Ellis passed away 2 mornings later. It was peaceful. No monitors. No alarms. Just a soft exhale and silence. She was 80 years old. At her bedside, Jacob. Her hand still in his. Outside, the sky was turning gold. Her funeral filled the small church on 76th Street. There were no politicians, no cameras, no awards. Just neighbors. Children she'd mentored. Men she'd fed during hard winters. Nurses who remembered her smile. Women who now lived in dignity because she had once opened her door. Jacob gave the eulogy. He didn't speak long. She didn't change the world with money or power. She changed it with kindness, consistency, and courage. She was my grandmother. But more than that, she was a light in the dark. If you carry anything from her with you, let it be this. Love isn't something you earn. It's something you pass on. A year later, a second building opened on the west side. The Lisa Wing. Named for Mary's daughter. Jacob never found Lisa's old records. No photos. No baby books. Just a few notes from a forgotten school counselor, and a memory of Mary's voice when she spoke her name. But he didn't need more than that. The Lisa Wing was built for young mothers with nowhere else to go. And above the entrance hung a plaque. In honor of every life that seemed lost and wasn't. At Ellis' house, a portrait of Mary now hangs in the main hallway. She's wearing her green coat, standing outside her old home, holding a loaf of bread and smiling like the wind doesn't scare her anymore. Every new resident passes by it on their first day. Some pause. Some stare. Some ask, who was she? And someone always answers. She was the reason this place exists. Jacob still visits the sunroom every morning with his coffee. He still feels her there. In the warmth. In the silence. In the way strangers treat each other like family. One morning he found a note on the table, written in pencil, neat and careful. It said, "Dr. Jacob, thank you for this place. I didn't think people like you were real, but now I know they are. Because people like her were too." He folded the note and slipped it in his coat pocket. Next to another one. An old envelope worn with time. Still marked. $327.